Hello and welcome to the Berean Book Club podcast with your hosts Francois Poe and Conrad Rieder, the podcast where we discuss books written by saints both dead and alive to see what they can teach us and the church today and hopefully spur us on in our love for Christ. We're so glad you're joining us. Hey everyone, welcome back to another episode of the Berean Book Club. We're glad you are joining us as we discuss a new book that we listened to, but it's quite old already, about a very convicting theme or topic, that of money. So what is this month's book that we listened to?
Yeah, we listened to Managing God's Money by Randy Alcorn. It's been a good book. We haven't done something like this before, so it's very new. It's much more practical. May even be one of the most practical books that we've done before. As Francis said just now, it's really been super convicting. Earlier this week, when we were trying to nail down an actual night to do the podcast, just before you put the phone down, you said, "Bro." We don't even know how to manage God's money. Are we really going to talk about this book?
Yeah.
And that's been very true. That's been a convicting book for the both of us, I think, as young guys trying to figure out how to take care of what God's entrusted to us well. With the nuances of being in ministry and having families and kids and so on. This has been a very, very helpful book. I think certainly the biggest strength for me has just been setting out some foundational principles. They might feel vague or broad, but they're really helpful in controlling and regulating, just providing us a framework to think about these things with. And so, as hard of a listen as it's been really, really helpful.
I think that's something that's important for us as me and you are in ministry, but also as young men trying to lead our families. I can't tell you with how many other young guys I've spoken to, and everyone's just clutching for whatever advice they can get as to how to manage your money. Like, what does that look like? The situation we find ourselves in is very different to what it was for my parents when they were my age. And they're also questioning, like, what is the right way to go about this? And so I found it necessary to say, okay, I don't know, like, where to really turn. I've heard good things about this book. It seems to be like money management 101. And I think both of us walk away being like, I don't know if we agree with everything he said.
Yes.
But the general principles that he lays out and the framework, as you say, that he gives us is hugely beneficial for us. And I think it will be to literally anyone who listens to this book. I think everyone will benefit from just having someone really straight to the point say, these are the passages in the Bible that deal with this. This is why it's important. And then in the light of this, let's talk about these things. What does it look like to think about debt? What does it look like to think about your credit card? What does it look like budget? What does it look like tithing? What does it look like inheritance for your kids? Yes. It's like he just deals practically with all those things. And again, because he's given you the framework, you can disagree with him in his conclusions, but at least like you with him in terms of the direction you want to go. And I've been very, very challenged by it. I think the next step is the same for all of us as Christians. It's one thing to be convicted of something. It's another thing to ask God to give you the strength to actually change and to put some of those things into practice.
Yeah, 100%. We were just saying this is one of those books that it's so easy to go, hey, this is great, and walk away from and not kind of implement any of it. It really is. But it has been very, very helpful. The book is broad and is very practical, so we're definitely not going to touch on everything which comes up in the book. Things like accountability with your money, debt, inheritance, that kind of stuff. We're not kind of necessarily going to tackle head on today. But what we are going to do is maybe just talk through some of the foundational principles. Again, not all of them exhaustively, but these are just some which is maybe stuck out to us particularly, and which is helpful just to regulate how we think about these things at a broader level.
Just quickly before we get to some of those principles, why do you think money is not something that's really discussed enough in our Christian circles?
Geez, man, that's such a good question. I'm not sure I've got an answer. Let me maybe just speak from my own experience. I think it's something which is difficult to talk about because it's a private thing. It's a private thing. It's private in a different way to some other things, like maybe certain sin struggles and so on. But it's a private thing that's hard to talk about, and you know that once you make yourself vulnerable in terms of where you're spending your money and so on, let me rephrase that. When you speak openly and honestly about where you spend your money and where you don't spend your money and how much money you spend on things, you make yourself vulnerable to a certain level. If we take seriously the way in which the Bible speaks about the connection between our hearts and the things that we spend our money on, what that means is the moment that we show some sort of vulnerability and transparency with what we spend our money on, inadvertently we show some transparency about our own hearts, because the one reflects the other. And that means that you open yourself with any type of vulnerability to two things, judgment or grace. And that's a very scary thing to do. As with anything, when you open yourself about sin or about particular struggles that you've got with certain things or relational difficulties or you name it, whenever you make yourself vulnerable, that's what you open yourself up to. And in an unexpected way, because of the connection between our hearts and what we spend, as soon as you start talking about where you spend your money, you make your heart vulnerable. Yeah,
it's because we truly do believe there's a connection between where we spend our money and our hearts and where our hearts are at. Oh, that was good. Thanks. And so maybe as we move on to some of those principles, one of the things he talks about is just how we think about ownership. So we'd speak about my money. What do I do with my money? And he challenges that in a certain way. So what's that first principle that he kind of deals with?
This is really perhaps the one thing which he wants to nail down right at the beginning, that almost carries everything else which he says. And he's got this question: stewardship or ownership. The money that you have, whose is it? And the case that he makes from the Bible is that it actually doesn't belong to you. It belongs to God. Everything belongs to God as the creator of all things, which means the money that you have, even the money that you work for and that you've earned, that's really money which has been entrusted to you under God's sovereignty. That's money which has been entrusted to you, and so you're a steward of those resources. You're not the owner of those resources. Which is it sounds like a simple principle, and it is, but it's got some remarkable implications for how we think about what we do with our money. Perhaps the most obvious one is just in the way that we speak. It really shows how we think about these things. So we might say, at the beginning of the month, you give a certain amount of your money to God in your offering or your tithe or wherever you stand there. But yeah, I mean, if this is the regulating principle, you're not giving some of your money to God. Everything that you have belongs to Him. Everything is already His. And that does two things. I think it frees you in like a massive way. I don't think you need to feel like the guilt of how much of what you have are you giving to God, and what does that mean about what you think of Him, etc., etc. So it really frees you from that, because you don't really have any liberty to give things to God. But at the same time, it puts like a massive expectation, a massive responsibility on you as a steward of everything that is already God's. And I think that's a big deal, and that's a big shift in how we think about the things that we have, that they're not ours. They're things that God has entrusted to us to steward.
Yeah. And so, I mean, that's specifically thinking the basic principle of God owns everything. We are stewards entrusted with that which God has given us. And then He focuses in on money specifically. So you got stewardship, which is broad, and we agree. And then He goes into saying, well, this is very specifically also true about your money. And the Bible has quite a lot to say about your money. And so his kind of tagline is God's money managers. That like comes up over and over again. But it reinforces that idea. He constantly wants you to kind of drill it into your head that the fact that if what I'm saying is true, if what God is saying in His Word is true, that this is all His, then we are only managers. We don't own any of it. And that should have implications far and wide as we think about what does it look like to steward this in light of God's will and His revealed purposes in the world, which He touches on a little bit later. He then speaks a little bit about just the way in which money is usually spoken of. Even in our Christian spheres, we speak of, or you often hear it say that money is the root of all evil. That's kind of the expression. What does he say what does he say about that?
This is actually a really thoughtful thing from his side. I think he's really trying to correct a misconception here about how we think about money. So you've got the classic idea that money is evil or is a root of evil, and he corrects it very plainly. The passage that's referred to is 1 Timothy 6:10. It goes, "For the love of money is a root of all kinds of evil." And the case that he makes is that money is not a root of evil. It's evil. Our heart's evil. The love of money, he says, that's heart language. The love of money, when money has an inordinate place in your heart, that is what kind of breeds evil. And I think this is a really, really helpful corrective. Just in how we as Christians think about money. Money comes up a lot in the scriptures. I think he opens up the book like this, that Jesus spoke more about money than anything else he did. And obviously Jesus engages with money at a negative level quite oftenly as well.
Yeah.
Rebuking those who are materialistic or just kind of gathering up wealth for themselves and kind of pressing the poor down and so on. And so Jesus speaks about things that way. And at a surface level, I think it's very easy for us to read those parts of the Bible and vilify money.
Yeah.
But obviously, as we read the whole story of the Bible, the narrative is that our hearts are sinful. That's where these things spring up from. And what I think is most helpful just about this corrective is that it helps not to fall off the horse on either side. The first one, and this was quite convicting to me, He says right off the back of this, in that chapter where he's unpacking this, he says that somehow we seem to think that if we just had more possessions, we'd be more generous. If I had more to give, then I would give more, and I'd be more generous with people around me, and so on and so on. And his pushback is, really, do you really think that if you're not generous when you have little, that all of a sudden you'll be generous when you have a lot? And his case is that you're locating the problem in the wrong place. He's saying what you're inferring is that you're not generous because you don't have enough. And that's not saying that the problem is in the heart. If you really believe the problem was in the heart, then if you're really generous, you'd be generous with little, or you'd be generous with a lot. And so I think this corrective is just helpful in that way of falling off the horse, where we kind of we just mislocate sometimes the way in which we think about money. Where the issue really lies, it lies in our own hearts, not in us having too little or too much. And on the other hand, he doesn't explicitly tackle this, but he kind of infers it a little bit later in the book, after a few chapters after this one. But he speaks about how, obviously, because money is not bad in and of itself, God sometimes gives people a lot of money. He does that, and he lists some characters in the scripture, so Abraham and Job, for example, and that's God's prerogative to do that. So often, I think we can fall into the trap of speaking in a way, or at least thinking in a way, that anyone who has a lot of money is either selfish, or they're definitely selfish, or they're definitely materialistic, or they're definitely giving their lives to chasing having a lot of money. But that's not necessarily the case. That may just be a gift, that God has given there. It's not wrong for someone to have a lot of money. And again, it's the same. The root is the same. It's a mislocation of the problem, saying that money is evil, and so when someone has a lot of it, that's evidence that they're evil. Where actually the scriptures speak about evil residing in the heart, and loving money too much becomes a problem. Not having money too much,
No, and I think those two things are very prevalent for us, and something that we need to remember. I do think we often vilify the rich, but in our situation, we also, I feel convicted myself, even in some of the stats and in our country as well. It's like rich also becomes very subjective. I find myself looking up and looking underneath and recognizing where I fit in, and almost everyone can do that. And so I think these principles helps us, no matter where you fit into this spectrum, that which God has given you, kind of how to think about your possessions, first from a point of contentment, where this is where God has kind of placed me right now, and then how am I going to steward the money, whether it be little or a lot, to have a healthy relationship with money, so that actually you can manage it well and use it for good.
Yes.
Which he kind of like will go on to say.
And you don't need to have a lot of money or a reasonable amount of money to have a healthy relationship with it. He alludes again to the woman who breaks the perfume.
Yes.
On Jesus' feet, and he uses that as a bit of a case in point, that the amount of possessions you have it doesn't necessarily equal generosity, as we sometimes think. And so it's really challenging to think about how we think about money, regardless of how much money that we have. As you say, that's obviously a relative thing to say. Most of us have people above and people below us, but yeah, the point is the challenge is for both.
Yes.
The challenge is for us all, in how we think about our relationship with money.
And so as he kind of like wants to convince us to really think about where we actually now spend our money, what we invest in, he uses kind of this principle, this treasure principle that he calls us to motivate us. Yeah, tell us a little bit more about the treasure principle and how you feel about it.
Yeah,
maybe have a bit of a discussion.
So this is maybe the first big turning point in the book. So from this point on in the book, he picks up this idea, which he calls the treasure principle, which is based on his words in Matthew 6. For where your treasure is, there your heart will also be. And he makes some really interesting observations. I think the one thing which really stands out is he says that if you look closely, Jesus isn't against storing. He's not against storing at all. What he's challenging here is where you store. So don't store up for yourselves treasures on earth. Matthew 6:19, but 20, but store up for yourselves treasures in heaven. So he says Jesus isn't saying don't store. Jesus is just concerned where you store. And this is really what kind of undergirds where the book unfolds from here. This idea of not being kind of earthly focused with how we spend our money, but to look to eternity, the earthly investments versus the eternal investments idea. And then he unpacks things from here and stuff. He touches on some things which were a surprise to me, for sure, things like heavenly rewards and so on, which definitely there's some uncomfortability and so on there.
So on that, I think something that he does really well, and if I'm not mistaken, he's actually written quite a lot about heaven as well in light of these kind of principles, because he critiques this idea that our end goal is to be in the air and worship God forever, and that's what heaven's going to be like. Where he says if you actually go and look at the way in which especially the New Testament looks forward to what heaven will be like, the idea of work is not just taken away. There's a sense that we're going to inhabit the new heavens and the new earth, and there we will dwell with God, but also be at work in the city, the new Jerusalem. And so I found that like extremely helpful, because it is a corrective that I think is necessary. It pushes our eyes forward to see the continuation of a lot of what we do here on earth will continue into eternity, especially as we think about things that have eternal consequences. But I think the place where I was at least a little bit uneasy, and this is not necessarily saying that he's wrong, just it's something that I'd have to like ponder a little bit further, is the place that he gives to rewards that we receive for these eternal investments. So he puts the emphasis that one of the ways in which the New Testament God encourages us and how we spend our money is to say, well, when you invest in eternity, there are rewards awaiting you in eternity, and that's a motivation. And I think he does a good job to show that we can have many different things that motivate us. We don't have to always put them off against one another. That's not fair critique. I'm just struggling to kind of put it together with what we see in the text, which is there and I have to grapple with, and the fact that how I will value rewards compared to knowing and seeing my Savior face to face and dwelling with him. For me, that kind of trumps any reward that I could get. And so that's something, at least for me in reading the book, that I'm like, whoa, I need to think about this a bit more. I don't know if I feel I need that motivation to kind of listen to what he has to say.
Yes.
But maybe because it's definitely something I struggle with, and I think it sounds like something that everyone kind of like does grapple with, is the place that money has in our hearts. And so I found that both helpful and very interesting.
No, for sure. I think that's the very thing which is uncomfortable for me as well. And I think what we've got to wrestle with is some of those texts are they're there, not explicitly about incentivizing the way in which we spend our money, but the idea of rewards in heaven, that feels arbitrary.
Yes.
Any idea of kind of merit or reward on our part, even though it be after salvation, that's, you can't help but just want to stop and want some more info, So I think that incentivizing of how we spend our money and what that achieves and how much of a motivation that is certainly something which I think both of us might say we'd maybe disagree, or at least say that we're uncertain whether that's how we should think about those things. And I think especially what you've said about just in eternity, those rewards in comparison to the great reward of the glory we receive in being with Christ, being in his presence again.
Really known.
They can, well, let me say this, it's the same as what you've said. It's hard to see how there is even a comparison there. And how that idea of rewards would play out. But again, this isn't his most thorough dealing with his treasure principle, and I think we want to be fair to that as well. It sounds very much like it appears elsewhere in some of his literature, and we want to be cautious to represent him well too. Final thoughts? From your side on the book?
I think two more things I just mention as someone who just listened to the book once. The practical sections in his book is helpful precisely because we don't really have honest conversations about money with people. And so here you have, without having to be vulnerable, you have someone telling you kind of straight and to the point, like, listen here, let's talk about debt. Like, how does that play itself out? What are the statistics on debt and how people function within debt? What are some of the dangers? Okay, don't be fooled by it's almost just like helpful advice guided by someone who's thought about money, and not just from a financial point of view, but actually from a Christian point of view and the place that it will have in your heart. And so I think here he moves on to like the implications of his theology of money that he's laid out. And whenever we move into application, there's stuff we'll agree with and there's stuff we won't agree with. But I think he's thorough enough to give you enough to chew on. And so I don't think it matters who you are. I think this is a book that will greatly encourage you to think about how you spend your money, God's money.
You see, there it is.
Yeah, precisely. And I think encourage you. I was reading a review of the book, and the guy said, he made me want to give all my money away. And then it's like, thankfully I didn't do that. But after 3 days, it really made me change the way in which I think about these things. And so I'd encourage you to do that. I'd also just kind of realistically state that this is a book written to first world country, America, 15 years ago. That's a different situation than we find ourselves 2024 in South Africa. And so there's certain places where that plays itself out a little bit more clearly. I think his would almost say his tone of voice, although he's not the one reading the audiobook. So the tone of his book is quite strong, that I'm not that sure would be the case if he was writing into our situation. So, but I want to be charitable there to recognize. I think there's a place for something like that to have been written the way it was. But that's just something to keep in mind as you listen to this. There's some places where you're just like, this won't play out in my situation, and that's okay.
That's very good. That's very good. Maybe just off the back of that, he does write strongly, but it's such a helpful book that it's worth pushing through some of his strong statements, even some sections which you might disagree with, just because of like the sheer amount of ground that he covers and how practical he is. It's really a worthwhile read. And then I think the reality for all of us is, after you've read a book like this, speak to someone and at least tell them what's going on with your money, and so that there's a place for this discussion to continue, because it's like that with anything. But managing God's money by Randy Alcorn.
That was awesome.
It was good. But what is next?
Next up, we've got Can We Trust the Gospels by Peter Williams. This is a little bit more apologetics. This is also quite new. We've done some cultural apologetic stuff, but this is classic apologetics. Can we trust the New Testament? And so, it's going to be good. It's going to be interesting. He's done some great work. I know there was a conversation between him and Bart Ehrman, a video on, I think, Premiere, with Justin Briley, which was a good debate. And so that was 2 years ago, I think. And ever since then, I'm like, I want to listen to this book. So listen to it with us. Can We Trust the Gospels by Peter Williams? And thanks for joining us. Grace and peace. Thank you so much for listening to this episode of the Berean Book Club podcast. We'd love for you to head over to your podcasting app and give us a review and subscribe to the podcast. It will help us so much. This podcast was brought to you by BTI Stellenbosch. BTI Stellenbosch exists to bring theology to the church. If you want to find out more information, you can head over to btistellenbosch.com. Until next time.